You're listening to the Dungeons, Dragons, and Psychology Podcast. Laughter could be considered one of the most contagious of emotional experiences, and psychology has told us that perhaps laughter evolved to facilitate bonding across large groups of people. You've heard me say many times on my show that one of the best things about role-playing games is the ability to sit down with your close group of friends and to laugh and have a good time. But what if your entire campaign was centered around the idea of creating laughter? I'm Robert Walker, author of Session Zero, the DMG to writing great campaigns in any system, and this is my show where I teach collaborative storytellers how to have more memorable campaigns using psychology. And on today's episode, I'm sitting down with two of the folks from Dungeon Radio Hour to discuss why laughter is so important and how to have a bit more comic relief in your own stories. So let's meet our guests.
Hi, everybody. My name is Dalton Riddle, the host and dungeon master for our show, Dungeon Radio Hour.
And I'm Andrew Gerline. I am one of three players on Dungeon Radio Hour, so I am subject to the whims of Dalton.
Let's talk about your guys' show. And honestly, before I start asking you questions about it, to my listeners out there, my cyclothids, I have to say, this is hands down. I'm not pulling your guys' chains here or fucking around with you. In the last couple of weeks since I started listening to your show, it has become my all-time favorite actual play podcast.
What?
So I am thrilled to have you guys on.
Oh my god!
And I should tell you, you might want to start putting a disclaimer on the beginning of your episodes, because I drive back and forth through the mountains to one of the restaurants that I run, and there have been a few times on those windy roads I have been laughing so hard I can't breathe. I have had to pull over and catch my breath and thinking I'm going to crash my car because this shit is so damn funny.
That is absolute highest compliment we've ever gotten.
100%.
Crashing cars is our standard.
That'll honestly,
if we're not crashing cars, we're not doing our jobs.
That compliment will get us through the rest of the year as far as goodwill is concerned. So
yes.
Thank you.
My wife doesn't even need to tell me she loves me anymore. I'm full to the brim.
Well, my whole intention behind it is just to make sure you guys keep putting out this show because it's awesome and I'm addicted to it. I can't wait.
Oh, well, thank you so much.
Yeah, that was amazing. So, thank you, Robert.
So let's actually converse about it now that I've stroked your egos a little bit here. What gave you the idea for this podcast? I mean, you guys all know each other. You've talked about it on the show a little bit, how you all met in theater school, or some of you were writing, some of you were acting. But what made you decide, let's start a podcast like this?
So we as a group, myself, Andrew, Mike, and Alyssa, who are the other two players on the show, and then a few other friends that we also met in theater during school, we've all been playing D&D together for, I'd say, 6 years or so. And one day, I just got this wild idea while listening to another D&D podcast. I was like, we should do this ourselves. You know, we already sit around on a Zoom call and we play D&D for 6 to 8 hours. Why not record it and see what we can make out of it? And so that turned into me messaging Alyssa. And I was like, hey, I've got this idea. And she's like, I absolutely love it. Let's run with it. That turned into her asking Mike, who is her husband. And then, of course, we roped Andrew in for our fourth member because we wanted to keep it a small table. And we figured that we had the pieces that we needed between the four of us to really go somewhere with something.
I think the size of your group is really conducive to making such a great show. You all play off of each other very, very well. You have very good comedic timing together. I think that makes a lot of what you have so special. But also, I think it's just easier to follow as a listener because it's not this 7, 8, 9 person table.
Yeah, 100%. When we were setting things up in the very beginning of this show, Alyssa and I actually listened to several different D&D podcasts. We would just type in D&D in the search bar of a Spotify or Apple podcast, and we would listen to show after show after show just to get some ideas about table size and story flow and different things that they were bringing to the table so we could take the pieces that we think would work for us and then just leave all the rest.
And I did none of that. Okay, so when we used to when we first started playing, we all lived in Los Angeles together, and we would meet up at like maybe 8 a.m., 9 a.m. on a Saturday. We'd play for 12, 13 hours straight, and we wouldn't finish the campaign, mainly because we were all just, messing around, trying to make each other laugh and getting sidetracked. And I think in a way we kind of are leaning into that with the podcast, because it was fun for us, and we're like, maybe other people will think this is fun too. So the goal is just to make each other laugh, and we happen to be playing D&D at the same time.
So for my listeners who haven't had a chance to catch your show, would you guys just go ahead and tell them a little bit about your show, about the premise, what the characters are, how they got into the world they're in, or maybe no spoilers, but the situation they find themselves in?
The main storyline is that Dalton, our DM, from the real world has been sucked into a portal into the world of D&D in the Forgotten Realms. So in our first opener pilot campaign, Mike, Alyssa, and myself wake up in the Forgotten Realms. We find that we've been taken here as well, and now we have to track down Dalton and find a way back home. So that's kind of the plot, but I'd say more in tone, it's the way we like to say it is it's an improv comedy podcast set within a game of D&D. So the comedy comes first, but we are moving the plot around, and we explore this fantasy world. We're seeing goblins, we're doing magic, we have no idea what's going on, and so there's a lot of comedic bits in discovering a new world where we are the fish out of water. And so, that's kind of the basis of the storyline there.
I do have to ask, the experience of playing yourself as a character in the Forgotten Realm setting, one thing that I've been curious about since I started listening was, what was the process that you guys went through to create your character sheets? Like, how was figuring out your stats as a character?
So we did do a session 0, and we originally recorded session 0. And it was before we really had an idea of what we were doing as far as sound is concerned, recording is concerned, and the quality is awful. So we did not release it. We are toying around with the idea of trying to clean it up as much as we can and releasing it as bonus content. But I essentially sent everybody a blank character sheet. I was like, all right, guys, we're going to go standard. So 15, 14, 13, 12, 10, 8. I want you to pick stats that you feel are specific to you. And that's how Session 0 started out. We were picking things that we felt worked for us. Like Alyssa, intelligence 15, hands down, nobody argued with that. But then as we started going more and more into the character sheets and picking stats and everything like that, we started saying, okay, well, actually, I don't think your strength is going to be a 12. I think it's more of a 14. And we started kind of building each other together. And then I let everybody start off with a bonus feat, which is something I do for all of my games that I DM outside of this podcast. And the bonus feats also were things that they felt were personal to them, something that they could relate to as far as the background is concerned, or as far as the feat is concerned within the confines of the D&D 5e structure.
So I got to say, in real life, we have several times over our very long history of playing games together, my group has tried to play games as ourselves, either sucked into the real world or more of like a D20 modern type system. Generating stats has always been the part we always come up in arms about, and sometimes we've like, let's do an IQ test and let's go to the gym and figure out what our strengths would be and do all these ridiculous things to try and make our character sheets as realistic as possible. And by the time we get done with that, we're like, let's not play this game. I'm pretty a weak character. Like, my stats suck. I don't really want to play this character.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, so I've got I actually have my character sheet in front of me, and I'm looking at how my stats are. We were honest with ourselves, and I think this 4 of us have known each other for, like 14 years by now. Least. So we all know how to be honest with each other, and we know how to make fun of each other. And since this podcast was meant to be a comedy, we could maybe exaggerate certain physical attributes of ourselves or skills. But yeah, we pitched ourselves stats, and we kind of almost did like a dissertation against the other three who would poke holes in our stats, and we would kind of work them out from there. And I think they ended up pretty accurate.
I would say
I mean,
so.
it does sound like it. One thing that I think is really interesting is your show feels very different from other D&D actual play podcasts. And I think a big part of it is the fact that it is sort of this impromptu, almost sketch-like in certain circumstances. Like I'm thinking of Andrew, where you and Michael were playing off of each other, passing the horse bone back and forth and using it as sort of a microphone, taking turns of, okay, thank you. No, thank you. Okay, here you go. Thank you. You can speak now. And one of the parts that almost made me crash, by the way. But this whole idea of comedy in the D&D space is what I really wanted to talk about today, because I do think there's so much value, and I mention it over and over and over again in my show, how important it is to get together with your friends and be able to let loose and laugh and have a good time. So can you tell me a little bit of why you made that decision to make it comedy instead of more serious?
I don't think we made the decision as much as the decision made itself for us.
Okay.
Going back to the games that we've been playing ever since we as a group always started to play D&D, like Andrew said, we would play for 12 to 14 hours and get through maybe 3 major plot points because we would get sidetracked so often with doing a bit or trying to get one another to break character or to laugh during the story and trying to be as ridiculous as we possibly could be. Because what you're essentially doing is taking, in this instance, 4 adult children and putting them into a sandbox and saying, okay, go play pretend with your friends for an hour. Right. And that, like Andrew said, we've known each other for so long. We understand each other's comedic stylings. We know when someone's going to pick up the punchline. We know what their tics are when it comes to performance. And I think we leaned into that. We knew what our strength was going to be coming out of the gate. And I think we ran with it, and we were like, okay, this is what's going to set us apart from everything else that you're going to listen to.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. And I think, we definitely we trust each other. We can read each other. We all come from, we met at theater school. What a great financial decision that was. We met there. Dalton and I even stayed for an extra year.
We did indeed. Woo. Victory lap.
Yeah. And so I guess we spent all of college trying to make each other laugh, and that just continued on. So in a way, we didn't really even discuss if it was going to be a comedy or if it was going to be more plot driven or whatever. We just played like we've always played. And I mean, people have been responding well to that. And I don't know. I always thought maybe our sense of humor was just for us and no one else would like it, but it seems like, it's playing well, so we're just going to keep doing what we're doing. What we've always been doing, which is just being jackasses. I mean,
I've got my wife listening to the show and laughing, and she doesn't listen to any actual play podcast. She thinks they're ridiculous, but she listens and she says, "Man, if our games were more like this, I would enjoy playing a lot more." Which I think that's an important thing to mention for the listeners is, sometimes you don't have to be so serious. You can just let go and have a good time.
Absolutely. And D&D, I think, is it's intimidating from an outside perspective. I mean, you have it in pop culture. I mean, you got there's no denying Stranger Things had a big impact on the boom over the last few years.
Oh yeah.
You know, there's a D&D movie coming out. It seems to be there's episodes of Community and all these current pop culture things. And so, but from an outsider who's never played, it's like, oh, well, you have to kind of be a nerd and you have to, create all these characters with all these numbers and you got to roll dice. And it's like, yes, but it's simpler than it sounds, but it's fun and you should be laughing and having a good time. And the rules can sort of come secondary. And so I think if the result of our podcast is to hopefully draw more people in who were originally intimidated by it, and they can see that this is just fun, and we're sometimes barely rolling dice because we're drinking urine out of a a dwarven, ale glass or
Dwarven
something.
roulette.
And we're spending half an hour, crawling inside of a horse or something.
Yeah, that was trying to puppeteer the horse.
Yes, yeah. So it doesn't have to be
those are great moments.
serious nerdy. It can be silly and yeah.
What do you think above all? Is it the comedy? Is it the camaraderie? Is it just the fact that you guys all work together so well? I mean, what is it about your show that you think really should drive new listeners to it?
It's a good question. I think at the end of the day, we want to give people a break from the real world. And we want to draw you in, make you laugh, make you smile. If you're coming to our show for like super plot driven and like well developed characters, you're not going to find it. They might be sprinkled in every once in a while, but the way the show is set up and the way that we market it is 60 minutes of just ridiculous. You're asking yourself, what did they just say? What are they actually trying to do? If you try to put our show within the rules and confines of D&D 5e, you're going to come up short every single time because, like Andrew said, the rules come secondary to everything that we do. Mm-hmm. Our main focus of the show is just to have fun and share our laughter, our gift of comedy, our joy for the game and for each other with literally anybody and everybody.
Yeah. And so the name of the podcast is Dungeon Radio Hour. And so that what we kind of wanted to bring to the overall feel of the show was, back in the day, there weren't TVs. People would sit down and they would listen to essentially a play where there's, everyone's playing different characters. There's sound effects. There's music swelling. It's almost like you're watching a movie, but in your head. And I think once we realized that we wanted to do that, complete with, fake commercial breaks about, maybe like an ox dealership in the area or, something like come get your swords polished or, just ridiculous things that kind of spoof the real world.
Right.
By doing that, I think by spoofing the real world, you take, like Dalton said, you take the edge off of all the seriousness and darkness that's happening in the actual news and in the actual world.
One thing I have noticed that I really do appreciate, and you're talking about your theater background, is especially when it comes to times where, in my mind, my first reaction is like, oh no, maybe that wouldn't normally work like that in a game. But if the narrative is good, you, Dalton, are very good as a DM of saying yes and in a way of speaking. Mm-hmm. It's always like, no, you know what? That's exactly what you're doing because that is the awesome story narrative way of doing this. So I don't care really what the rule book says or what the role says. Like, yes, and that's what you're doing, and here's what happens because of it. And I really like that.
Well, I mean, it goes back to the golden rule of improv, which is always yes and. You have to keep the story moving along. You can't be negative, say, no, you can't do that, or no, that's not going to work. The only time you're going to really hear me say no while we're playing the podcast is if you do fail a roll, or if you're like Mike and you keep trying to use spell slots and you haven't rested yet. But I mean that's what we do. At the end of the day, we market it as an improv comedy show, and you can ask these guys or Andrew because the rest of the team isn't on the call. But he speaks for all of us. They get outlines before every episode drops. This little behind the curtain view, and it is the most bare boned outline you could possibly imagine. It goes intro, sound effect, flashback, sound effect. I give them 3 or 4 plot points. I'm like, you guys need to hit A, B, C, and D. Everything that happens in between, I don't care.
Right. It's because if we don't have an outline, we will veer off course. We've had to record maybe 3 episodes because we just got into some nonsense and didn't advance the plot at all. So we started doing that, and that's helped. And it also helps that Dalton has never said no, and he's always at least said, roll me for it, roll for it.
Right. Let's roll to see how that works out for you.
Exactly. Yeah. So that helps us feel like we can do and say anything. And so,
I think it is fair that you, Andrew, are speaking for everyone else since you are the only one who's carrying around the speaking stick. So
that's true. That's true. Yeah. I have this.
It does make sense. So in the recording of this and in producing it, you use a lot of sound effects. You use a lot of sort of like short musical pieces to really bring further immersion into the story. It's not just theater of the mind. You are putting some of that audio and technical expertise into it that really kind of draws the listener in. I mean, how do you find the time to do all that? That seems like a really Herculean task in editing.
About that.
So Mike and Alyssa are our editing gurus, and they take on, I would say, 90%, if not all of the work when it comes to the edit and putting things into place. Alyssa and I do listen to the raw footage before it makes it to editing, and we just go through and we make notes of like, okay, we want this to happen here, or cut that completely, doesn't make sense. But for the most part, Alyssa and Mike have done the bulk of the editing. Everybody kind of has their own role when it comes to the podcast, and they were kind enough to kind of take that and run with it. Stuff that they've never really done before we started this show, so they're kind of learning as we go, and that's why you will notice that the show gets better and better with each episode as we learn new things.
Yeah.
Right. And it should be noted that those two, Mike and Alyssa, are married, so it helps. They can tag team together in the same house.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I guess many hands do make light work, and I'm just kind of looking at it, and it's like I do my show all by myself. So I thought, man, if I was putting all sound effects and all this kind of stuff,
you convince your wife to do everything.
Right, yeah, seriously. she's a great text editor. I don't know how she would feel about doing podcast editing.
Totally.
With it being so funny. I mean, you mentioned that you don't come to the show looking for a plot, but at the same time, it has been a pretty cohesive plot. As a listener, I am following the story, and there have been some non-funny moments that have been really good and stand up really well. I'm thinking of the bridge incident with the spiders, and the whole cliffhanging ending there was very well done. Like, I was in suspense during that scene. So I wouldn't say that it doesn't have those elements as well, but the comedy definitely shines.
Well, thank you. And it's funny that you bring up the scene on the bridge, because that was 100% made up in the moment. That was a true improv. So I give them an outline with story plots, and then I have my own DM notes, of course. And they were supposed to make it across the bridge. They were supposed to make it to the cavern that had Clark and the spiders, all that good stuff, all before that episode ended. And then they messed up their roles, and they didn't make it across the bridge. So we had to figure something out. And I went back and edited my notes. I just put, what the fuck?
When in doubt, spiders.
You know what? They're scary enough on their own that they just evoke emotion and sort of terror. But it was very well done. So
well, thank you.
So yeah, so if you want story, it's still there, guys. Listen to the show. It does have story too. Would you say as you move forward in this story, do you kind of already have, like, as you built this campaign, Dalton, do you have like an ending in mind, or are you just sort of letting the narrative go where it takes you?
It's a little bit of both. I have what I consider in my head the true ending for how I want this story to come to a conclusion. There, of course, are variants to that depending on what the three of them do as they do progress through the world of the Forgotten Realms. And then I'm letting the narrator just kind of pick it up as we go along the way.
And Andrew, as a player in this, playing yourself, how do you feel like your actions in game? Do you feel like if you were really in these scenarios, would your sort of like fun personality really kind of shine through in the same way if you're there with your friends? Or
I mean, if I actually got sucked into I would panic, and I'd probably think I was in a dream, and I don't know, man. I would probably try to unplug myself from the Matrix. There's only one way to do it.
That's right.
I don't know. I would definitely wouldn't jump across a pit. I wouldn't stab a spider. I would be cowering under the very first cart that we saw at the top of episode 1. I'd be cowering until I starved to death. But
well, I mean, you sort of did. Like you climbed right inside that horse to hide.
Right.
Like
I'm trying to somewhat do things that I would do, like hiding, and that's actually why I chose Ranger. Is I feel like if I were in a fantasy world all of a sudden, I would want to be something that gives me distance from scary things, because I don't really do like confrontation, and I don't like scary animals. I love animals, and I don't like, bears. I don't want to get attacked by a bear, so I'll be far away from a bear. So that actually helped me build my fantasy character, as well as taking those real life qualities and really kind of exaggerating them.
One of the things you guys do really well is you sort of mock the whole thing in sort of like an absurd manner. There's just this whole era of like, this would be so ridiculous in real life. Let's just all laugh about how absurd some of these stories that we play actually are, from a perspective of, if I was really there, man, this stuff is just off the wall. So let me ask you one more question before we go on to our tricks of the trade. Can you each tell me maybe a moment that has been your favorite as you've been recording this, or something perhaps that surprised you while you've been going along this process about the show or about yourselves?
I would say one of my favorite moments was, I don't want to spoil anything, but there is an NPC that dies at the end of episode, is it 4, I think? And I had major plans for that NPC going, like, progressing through the story. Unfortunately, we don't make it to any of those plot points because another NPC that's actually voiced by Andrew, who I gave complete creative freedom to. I was like, these are some of the ideas that you have. These are some of the thoughts that you have, some of the characteristics you should have. But for the most part, he had complete creative freedom. And wasn't expecting the decision that he made at the end of that episode. That's probably one of my favorite moments that we've had so far.
I think my favorite moment that was kind of like a aha breakthrough moment was we originally recorded our first episode and stopped the recording, and all of us were like, we should redo that. It was like an hour and a half of the first episode. We were like, we should re-record that. It wasn't quite as over the top the first time around. It was more dialogue heavy and such. The second time around, I don't know. Crawling inside of a horse was like the first thing my character did. Cutting open a dead horse and crawling inside to hide from goblins. And I don't know why it was such a stupid thing that probably should have been cut from any other podcast, but it almost like it flavored the rest of the episode, I think. And it, allowed that great, there was a 911 call from inside the horse with Dalton as the 911 operator. And like that ridiculous absurdity, I think wasn't there the first time we recorded it. And I don't know, the second time we were all just a little bit more free and open, and that allowed us to continue to be ridiculous in future episodes. And that's kind of become our thing.
I think going off that, Andrew, I think we tried to take ourselves too seriously the first time we recorded it.
Yes.
And we quickly realized that that's just not who we are as people or as a group.
I've run into similar things. Like I've listened recently to the couple first episodes of my podcast and been like, man, I was just trying to sound way too serious. I wasn't having enough fun with my show. And I think there's also one other episode where I listened to it again, and I was like, I shouldn't record when I'm tired. Like I need to, if you don't have that enthusiasm, you don't have that excitement in your voice, that really shows through. Mm-hmm. And in comedy, it's probably just as important, if not way more important, that you're really just fully present, fully there, and just ready to roll with whatever it is. But let's go ahead and move on to tricks of the trade. Okay, so in today's tricks of the trade, I've asked Dalton and Andrew to come with a couple of ideas of ways that you, my listeners, could bring some comedic moments to your own games. I've also got one of my own, and the one that I'm going to suggest is listening to their podcast and stealing some of their really hilarious ideas and then throwing it right into their game. Because I have already stolen a Nora out of your world. In my last session, I threw in the Bed Bath and Beyond and had the same Jeffrey, like the whole, I used the voice and everything. Like my characters
was a really
good
Nora, dude. Yeah, that was solid.
I spent some time on that episode. Like, I'm throwing this into my story. This shit is hilarious, and everyone at my table was laughing their asses off. I was like, yes,
God,
it is.
yes.
It's comedy gold. It doesn't matter what game it's in. It works.
That's beautiful.
Oh, that's amazing.
I think in any situation, if you want to add a laugh, I think it's hard to do because it is dependent on the situation and who you're with and the context. But I think subverting expectations is the quickest way to disarm someone and add a bit of comedic relief. Like, I don't know, you could be talking to a really giant, scary looking guy, but maybe when he finally talks after you give this spiel, maybe he has a little mousy voice, or the opposite. Maybe there's a fairy that's really tiny, but when you look close, it's just this big drunk guy with a fat beer gut and a wife beater on. You know, it's like, I think if you take people's expectations and turn them on their head, I think there's a laugh in there somewhere every time.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. It is, and I think that is the times in your show that really catch me off guard and make me laugh so hard. The Dwarven Roulette was a great example because my expectations was that Michael would just spit out the drink and be like, "This is piss. What is it doing?" And he sits there for like 2 minutes, like, "I gotta keep drinking it. It's in the room.
No one's making
somewhere."
him drink it. Yeah.
I'm sitting there, I'm crying in my car, like, "What the fuck is he doing?"
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think one of the biggest pieces of advice I can give as both a DM and a player is allow yourself to be silly. Allow yourself to have fun. I think a lot of times when people sit down for a role-playing game or they sit down for D&D, Pathfinder, Call of Cthulhu, whatever it might be, there's an automatic kind of reaction to be like, okay, I have to be in character. I have to be serious. These are high stakes.
Mm-hmm.
And you can have high stakes, but you can also have fun at the same time. And at the end of the day, in order to do that, you have to allow yourself to just have fun and to play and to be silly and to try things, even if it sounds stupid. Because when I did Honora the first time around, I stopped halfway through and I was like, guys, no, I can't do this. Like, this is dumb. This sounds awful. We cannot keep using this voice.
And we were like, no, yes, we can.
And they were like, no, they were like, shut up and commit to it. And so we kept going with it.
There was a moment in there in the podcast where Andrew said something like, "Damn it, if I knew that was the voice you were going to use for my aunt, I never would have agreed to be your nephew."
Oh, yeah.
And that was like the moment I was like, oh, it's so bad that it's so great. I have to use it.
Yeah. So like I said, allow yourself to be silly. And then from a DM perspective, because I know there are DMs out there that want to write page after page after page of planning and lore and notes. And that's amazing.
Which
that's
is
great.
very fun.
Like, I commend and I applaud you. Not how I DM, not how I run my games or the podcast. You have to allow room for the jokes to come in. You have to allow room for your players to play and not get them so bogged down in all the extra stuff, because then they do feel like they have to be on it 100% of the time and serious and in character, and give them permission, essentially.
Yeah, I think a great way of doing that, like you mentioned, is to throw in those NPCs that are sort of just over the top and ridiculous, because they know if you're having a great time, they can go ahead and have a great time. They can laugh too. They can be silly with their characters if you're being a little bit silly with your characters.
100%.
Exactly.
So before we sign off, tell the listeners where they can find the show, where they can get in touch with you, anything else you want to share about yourselves.
You can find us on social media at Dungeon Radio Hour on everything, Dalton, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok.
Yeah, so if they go to Dungeon Radio Hour on Instagram, there's a link tree to literally everything else that we're on. Like Andrew said, Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, our email if you want to reach out to us that way. And then our podcast is on every major platform. Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Podchaser, all that good stuff.
Yep. And I always say, if you do give us a listen and you love it, share it with your friends. And if you hate it, share it with your enemies. Just please share it with someone. And we would really appreciate it if you guys checked us out.
It is a great show. I will put links to the show and to your Instagram in the show notes. So all of my listeners who have enjoyed this episode, I mean, we had a lot of laughs on here, but trust me, when you listen to these guys' show, you're going to laugh your ass off just like I have. Like I said, my wife doesn't even listen to actual play podcasts, and she's been laughing right alongside this ridiculous and amazing story. So thank you guys so much for coming on the show today. I really, really appreciate it. And I love the show.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robert.
Yeah.
It's been amazing. Appreciate it.
Yeah, Robert, thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, I'm thrilled. I feel honored to have you guys on the show. You guys are that amazing. So listeners, please be sure to check out my book, Session Zero, The DMG to Writing Great Campaigns in Any System. You can find it on Amazon. And also a reminder that we are taking our season break after October 30th. We will be back with the beginning of the new year. And until then, we'll see you next session.